I think it may actually be the air whistling through the door. What whistling? Are we all ready? Are we all ready?
Yes, we're ready.
Get some. Anyway, welcome to Nordev at the Forum, which is very, very posh. I can't read my notes because they're too small. I've actually written a script for today. I'm getting fed up with sort of standing there and looking around and wondering who put what slide up. Mainly because we've got a camera. I don't want to be stood there going, where did this slide come from? What am I supposed to be talking about? So, I also want to talk quickly about a couple of things that Nordev have been doing for the past month or so. We've been working in collaboration with some of the local junior schools, working with change in the ICT curriculum. For those of us with... I don't know, do we have a mic?
It's not on.
It's not on. I'll speak louder. For those of you around about my age, the C in ICT is completely superfluous. I don't know, they seem to put it in there. Anyway, they're teaching 5-year-olds and above algorithms, programming and debugging, and teachers are absolutely bricking themselves. They don't know what they should be doing, they don't know how to do it. So we've taken a group of 12 teachers and given them a day-long session on the basics of how you can do this stuff. What we're hoping to do from that is actually take it out and give more sessions for teachers and maybe go into schools and help out in schools as well. Now, what would be great is if we can get some help from other companies and other people within Nordev. Is this on? My butcher? Like a rock star. So if anyone is able to give a couple of hours to come on and help, we've got a session happening here, which I think is on the 1st of April, that's not a joke, which will be a day-long session where we're just sort of talking to the public about basic things you can do with Raspberry Pis, basic things that you can do with Python and Scratch and things like that. So if anyone's interested, give me a shout and we can talk about it. We've also been working with the UEA, mainly on their employability stuff at the moment. We have at least one student here, singled out. So with there, I went over and had a talk with Paul about Norfolk developers, NordevCon and everything, and we're now looking about perhaps getting people to go to the university and start talking to them about how we use IT in industry. So can we start talking to them about agile practices and point out that that's not an advanced course, that's something they should be doing in year one, test-driven development, Git, various things like that. So when they're coming out of university and going to you guys for jobs, they've got the skills that we want them to have. So I know Paul's going to talk more about NordevCon later. I know what you're thinking, that yes, we've got a whole day, one day, 5 tracks, 28 speakers, after speakers dinner, which you really should go to because it's a great networking event. But it's not just that. We have a pre-event thing. You're putting a Facebook. It's more than just one day, 5 tracks, 28 speakers, and the dinner. We've got Russell Winder and John. Ah, that's why you're putting a face. Oh, this is John, who's coming up to do a talk for us. So Russell's talking about why wait for Java 8 when you can have Groovy. I think Java 8 comes out a few days later, according to the cake I've seen on Twitter. And then with the systems thinking from John. And then after that, that's all this year. That's the offices with the slide. And yes, I have just pulled slides from other presentations for this one. Afterwards, we're going for Pizza Express. I will be bringing some chili oil. If you don't like hot chili oil, don't have the chili oil. Seriously. Moving on to March, because of everything that we actually have going on in February, we've decided March is going to be a social. So I said 6-ish because I finish work early, so I'll probably be in the pub from 5:30 to be honest. So people can sort of rock up as and when, and we will find somewhere that does good beer and good food, and we can sit down, have a chat, have a drink. Then we've got Node School, so a half-day a workshop on Node.js. It's Tuesday, March the 11th, King's Centre, £15. The Neo4j workshop we did was really well received. It was really huge fun for those of us who went on it, so I seriously recommend going on this. And I know Paul, I haven't put my guys on, we'll discuss that later. Norfolk Tech Journal. This will be the latest issue. Unfortunately, we don't have any tonight, but it's coming out online tomorrow.
Online tomorrow, print by Friday.
Print by Friday. And those of you who are coming to NordDevCon, and I'm assuming everyone here knows about NordDevCon and has tickets for NordDevCon, and if you don't, the doors are locked and you're not allowed out until you bought them, you will be getting a copy of the Norfolk Tech Journal to do what I've done, which is basically buy a nice folder for your magazines, put them in order, and look at them and read them. On to tonight, we've got this bit. We've got the fact that my laptop hasn't synced with my desktop. Afterwards, we're going to have Paul and Vicky are very quickly going to talk about NordDevCon, just in case you weren't aware it's coming. Scott is then going to give his talk. We've then got a break, and then we're going to try room 101. And then afterwards, we're in the centre of Norwich. We'll probably go find a pub somewhere, have a few beers. So I shall pass you across to Paul. Like this.
I can't do the rockstar thing now, so I've got the hair for it anymore. I think there's about 2 people in this room who don't have conference ticket. You're new tonight? Have you got a conference ticket? Right, Ekshata, are you going to talk your friend into getting a conference ticket as well? So everybody else has got one. There's nobody else that hasn't got one, is there?
There's not much point doing.
Oh, yeah, we know you know about it, Wayne. So I thought your company had bought some, but just not for you. Maybe not. Right, so I'm not going to bore you all by telling you all about something when I've already sold you a ticket anyway. So
Just know we had a really good presentation.
we had an excellent presentation. We went to Ipswich, it's really well received, standing ovation. It was
I
wonderful.
made everyone laugh at Paul.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so I'm not going to do it, Dom. It's all right. Good. So, is there any more, or do you want?
No, I'm done.
Are you good, Scott?
Certainly, mate. No problem at all. Cheers, Paul. Do I need to hold this? Can people hear me at the back, or do I need to use a mic, or need a mic? Okay, we'll try that. Sounds like that for you. Right, that's probably a good idea. Was that getting on the camera too badly? That's all right. Right, okay. So I'll finish that. I promise I shall flick through the slides quickly enough. I don't think there's anything really particularly exciting on them, but I'm not going to talk about anyway. So, who am I? I am a very long-term developer. Unfortunately, I've probably been coding since I was 12 and got sat in front of a computer. BBC Basic, all those kind of things, way back when, you know, it was all very uncool and very boring. And it probably still is very uncool and very boring, but I don't care, I still work in it. Earn a living, it's good enough. I have spent most of my life probably developing in the early days in Pascal and Delphi. Fantastic environment if you're doing Win32 and Win64 stuff. But unfortunately I then migrated onto the .NET world, early 2000s, a bit reluctantly, but unfortunately I can say I'm quite happy with it now, and I'm still there. It's without doubt probably one of the things Microsoft did well. There are faults with everything, but you know, it's not bad at all. Okay, moving on from there. So, why this ORM? Well, ORMs have been around for a long time. Relatively new in computing terms, I suppose, for the last 5 years or so. But this particular ORM I first actually encountered when I was using Delphi. Bit novel, the whole idea of objects being objects and not worrying about the database and everything else, when, you know, 75% of the work I was getting paid for was writing code that interacted with a database. So I followed it for a while, used it a bit, and when .NET came around, it migrated into .NET. And at the time, I conveniently as well was moving on to .NET and picking up projects and started using it. And I have to say, it's a tool I keep coming back to. Even though there are other ORMs around that I use, I keep coming back to this one. It was designed by a group of Nordic people from Sweden, I think, and it's pretty well architected in my opinion. And they, should I say, were also involved when Borland bought out their company, with sitting on the group that were discussing things like UML, implementations and so on, and they've actually put quite a lot of time and effort into this framework. Started using it in Delphi, moved on to Visual Studio, started using it in Visual Studio. I do believe if you run it through Mono's analyzer, it's also pretty mono-friendly, so potentially you can also run it on a Linux environment. Also, it's been around much longer than most of the other ORMs. Entity Framework, XPO, if you've heard of any of those. They're all different ORMs around from different manufacturers, and it's been around a lot longer than any of them. So it's got quite a long history behind it. It's probably quite mature. Okay, I like it because I can interact generally by drawing UML diagrams to represent my classes which will be either persisted or transient and can be used in my application. I care about objects. We all write object-oriented code. We care about objects. We like using objects. We don't really care about the database. The database is somewhere to store the objects. In most cases. I'm not saying that that's an overall rule for every situation. Banks love the intricacies of fine SQL. Great, love them, leave it to them. This saves me an awful lot of time, way less development on the database. It's got quite a detailed implementation of UML, so I don't just have to have my attributes and my associations, I can also have derived versions of each. Class hierarchy, so I can inherit one class from another and so on, and it manages it all for me. It's really, really quite handy. If I want to then get to the object in code and actually use it like a normal object, I can do that as well. But I can also use the Windows data binding libraries and so on, anything that supports iList, binding list and so on, I can store the data and present the data in. Another thing that is absolutely fantastic about this framework, in my opinion, is when you are using things like the derived attributes, its implementation of the observer pattern means that if you rely on a value to calculate another value, if that other value in perhaps another object changes, if you are referencing and looking at that attribute at the same time, your calculation will change as well. So it does a lot of the work for you in the background. It's incredibly quick, generally, to prototype systems, especially in WinForms and so on, if you want to show off an idea of how you think a new data model or a data layer might work to the business team. Because at the end of the day, they will need to have the buy-in to say, yep, good idea, let's go ahead and perhaps look at investigating this a bit more detail. You can use it, I believe, in Silverlight. Personally, I've never even bothered trying Silverlight, but WinForms, WPF, and obviously ASP.NET and so on. Like I say, because I like objects. Okay, so the list of things keeps going actually. ASP.NET membership services. A lot of people use these things and it's very, very handy, but a lot of different databases out there and different ORMs and different tools all have a different way of providing this security infrastructure, user accounts, profiles and so on. This supports the standard approach. Out of the box, you can do that as well, okay? Persistent support. Well, you know, I don't really care what database my customer uses. Some will use SQL Server, some will use Oracle, some will use MySQL. I don't really give a monkeys, to be honest. They tell me where they want to store the data, I'll store the data. Fine, no problem. My framework will allow me to do that. That's great, that's a handy little tool, I like that. And what about if I come across a new database that I actually need to support? Well, back in the early days when I was using this in Visual Studio, there was no support for Firebird database, so I took it upon myself, I learned a few things, and to be honest, it took about 2 hours to write a new persistence layer to allow me to store it in that database. So I was like, that's actually quite handy, I can do this for any other database I come across. Quite nice, I like that. It is a code generation tool, so it will create your classes for you. There's no just writing your own plain old code. There is infrastructure, framework, and so on that's in place. But on the benefit from that, it also uses the partial classes approach in C# very well. So it will separate the auto-generated code from any code that you wish to implement in your own object. Any methods you want to provide, any other extra bits you want to do, fine, go ahead and do it. It's generally pretty well architected by these guys in the Nordic countries, and it's heavily based on interfaces. If you want to get access to the services, you can call elements of it and it will return an interface to you. The nice part about that as well is almost all of it is implemented in this way, including things like the caching mechanism and so on. So if you really, really wanted to, and you knew the deep and dark sides of its inner workings, and you wanted to improve on things, you can replace the whole caching mechanism. Personally, not bothered touching that one yet, that's quite complicated. Actually quite a hard one to find in some ORMs is the ability to have multiple packages. Say you have a package that you define for a general order handling. You also have a package that's defined for support. But you want all of these in one package, in one application. You want the one database potentially to store all of these things. I've come across a lot of ORMs where I can design a package, and that's great, and it will build the database for me and so on. And if I turn around to people and say, right, I want to extend on this with another model, which will be completely different, but somehow related, and eventually, in the fullness of time, and will probably be stored in the same database, they then look at you and go, yeah, back on the same diagram, mate. Okay. No, not so good. All right. Another element I really, really do like is the state machine support on this. It's very, very handy. It's pretty well architected as well. Again, it's comprehensive, and it offers me a lot of extensibility through events and so on that can be triggered. Things I don't find in some of the other ORMs I've used, OPFs I've used, like XPO. There are state machines and so on in other frameworks, but they're not quite as comprehensive. There are also capabilities to potentially draw from multiple databases. So in some complex environments, you've got databases in different locations, potentially on different servers, different types of databases, and you may need to map some of those and pull the data all into a central object model that you can manipulate and use. In some of those cases, you'll have to reverse engineer the databases and so on, the classes into the mapping information in XML. But it's completely possible you can draw on multiple different databases, so that's really quite handy. In the means of prototyping quickly, it will generate my database for me. I'll show you in a little while quickly how I can do that through the design interface. Push a button, it will go off, create my database, or recreate my database, create any tables, any fields and so on that I have modified in my design. It will do that all for me. And also it will allow me to export these to scripts that I can potentially use if I need to manually update a server elsewhere. And I like it because it just generally treats a database like a data store where I want to put my data if I am persisting my data. I'm not really particularly interested in some of the details. There may well be others that love the sort procedures and other aspects. That's great, not a problem. If you like that, that's wonderful, and in certain situations they are great. This is probably not a tool for everyone, but it is a tool in your tool set. Don't exclude everything that you know, just pick and choose the tools you need as and when you need them and when you think they're appropriate. Okay, let's geek it up. Another use for the 3-letter acronyms. Right. If you don't mind, I'm probably going to sit down and do things for this one. Okay, so in this particular case, I'm using Visual Studio 2012. Nothing particularly exciting about it. I'm hoping the microphone doesn't fall too far down. And in the main unit, there's not actually an awful lot of code for this form. I'll show you the form quickly. Most of it is done in this particular case using some of the controls that allow the toolset to translate from the object model into the data binding approaches used by .NET. Now I'll quickly show you the object model that I've created. It's a very simple one. It's nothing particularly exciting at all. We have a customer. The customer may have 0 or more orders. That order may have some order lines, and those order lines belong to that order. So if that order is deleted, those order lines pretty much have no meaning anymore, so we'll get rid of them, okay? Which, if any of you aren't familiar with composites in UML, this is what this diamond symbol means and represents, okay? So in this case, we're going to have some order lines, 0 or many again. I could make that it requires at least one. Make it require as many as you need. It's a nice benefit of UML. You can change the requirements of items as you see fit. And in this particular case, I have an order item requiring a product. The product doesn't technically need to know about the order item, though I can have it that way if I want to. So this is a one-way association, which is saying the order item will potentially use a product. In this particular case, I have said it must have a product, one product, because an order item without a product, pretty useless. Okay? So as you can see on the items here, and I'm sorry to say I don't think I can scale up the model to the point where you can actually look at it a huge amount. We have very simple elements. It's nothing exciting. You know, you all write classes every day, I'm sure. You write your attributes and so on. The only thing that perhaps may look different is the ones where you have a slash in front of it. Now, a slash in this particular case denotes a derived attribute, an item that perhaps is calculated, or maybe you have some programmatic code behind it that you wish to represent the data that it returns. In this particular case, I've written something here in display text, and I do believe I've got a method here that just goes off and does something for me. Okay, so this will return something for me, just a little bit of work, nothing exciting at all. The total value, on the other hand, is perhaps a little bit more useful. It goes off and creates a total for me for the order based on the order items that I have entered. Okay. You'll also see that there's a whole bunch of methods down here. Now these actually relate to this one attribute here called the state, which is a state machine on this particular object, the order, which, for those of you familiar with state machines, may enjoy the diagram. It's not particularly exciting, but all I represent here is that an object, in this case the order, may start its existence in a new state. And from that new state, we may try to approve it. Okay? And what I'm going to try to do here is just show that we can set certain constraints. So if an order has a total value of less than 300, perhaps you're quite happy for your sales staff to just approve that order and get on with it. It can flow through the system, it can go from approved to in progress, perhaps to packaged, dispatched, and then maybe eventually delivered to a customer. However, say an order includes some very expensive items and you're not sure who the customer is, or you just need your manager's approval to allow that to be passed. You also want that to be part of your mechanism in your state. You want to redirect to something else so that your managers will perhaps be aware that there's an order that requires their attention. And they can either decline it or potentially approve it and allow it to flow through the chain still. So, okay, we'll just move away from this. It's not particularly exciting. There's some other attributes. But the order item, the only actual attribute I've added to that is a persistent attribute is the quantity. So I'm going to rely on the fact that I'm going to interact with a product and a quantity of the product to come up with some values and so on to display in this particular order line. Right, so ignoring all of these items here, I'll just push a button because I've changed a few attributes and update my code, and then I'll just go back to the app. I'm just going to show you again that the main form really doesn't have an awful lot of code. Okay? In fact, that one can just hide its way. So in a couple of places I created new forms. I update the database and tell it to save objects to wherever it's configured to save them. And there's actually only two methods I've really provided implementation for. So let's get started. Now, in this particular application, I'm just using some standard WinForm grids. Nothing particularly exciting at all. But I have some buttons here that actually do some work for me. Now, I'm going to create a customer. And I'll just call them customer 3, 003. Okay, and we're going to create an order for this customer. Give it a reference, I don't know, say part of the customer number and then a number. And as you can see, the state here is already marked as new. Okay, so it knows it's a new object and it knows it starts in that state. So we're going to create an order item. And we're just going to select one from the list. Hang on a second, where are my products? Well, I just created a few products in there earlier. Just to help speed this along because we haven't got an awful lot of time. I've got some expensive items that will take it over perhaps the £300 mark. I've got some mid-range items and some cheap items, okay? Nothing exciting. So I'm going to add a cheap item into my things there, and I'm going to perhaps have 4 of those. You can see instantly my order value has changed and I've done nothing, okay? I'm going to add another order item. Let's perhaps have one expensive item. Let's see. That one. Okay. So what's my total so far? Okay, we're up to 500. Okay, that's really good. Okay, so if I just show you quickly another screen, orders require an approval. you can see I currently have one order on there that's currently waiting approval, and that's for customer 1 that's got an order value of nearly £600. So if we go back to customer 1, you can see that there's one requiring a review, so I set it running in motion earlier. Okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push approve order, and in this particular case you see it's gone to the state of requires a review. You expect that because we set it to a total of greater than 300. So what happens if we create another order for this customer that doesn't require so many? Okay, so let's just go and create some very simple items, and we'll perhaps just put a couple of items in there of that type. Yeah, okay, that's below the order value, that's fine for me, so I'm going to push approve, and you can see it's gone straight to approved in this particular case, in the state here. So if I push the button asking me to see the orders awaiting approval, you can see my new order in there for customer 3 is actually listed straight away, and I can interact with it further, so I can either approve it, decline it, and so on. Okay. Now let's just take a look at some of that code quickly, shall we? Lovely Visual Studio, excellent crash. So what did I do when I was working with approving that particular item? So what I did was I interacted with the mechanism that allows me to interact with my objects, which was the handle provided by this toolset to allow me to interact with the orders and so on. So down here, if I show you briefly some of the tools, I have this element here called the expression. Now in the world of UML, it uses something called OCL, which is Object Constraint Language, which is kind of like SQL for objects. I hate to use that term because it's not really the same. There's a lot more you can do in OCL that you can't do in SQL. Because SQL is pretty much all about just grabbing data from databases, executing stored procedures, and so on. Nothing particularly exciting. Object models, as you know, can be much more complicated. They can also be much simpler. But there is no direct relationship between objects and databases. There are very few object databases out there that are true object databases. Most things map to a relational database in one way or another. So what am I doing here? What I'm asking for is I'm asking for the customer class and all instances of that we have in our database. Okay? And this one particular list is for all customers, returns, and is bound to here in my data grid, listing all customers. Okay? So when I move on to the next one, I want the specifically selected customers' orders. Okay, so unfortunately, in the way that .NET works, you need to get the context of the object that's actually data bound at that point in time. So you need to have a kind of a middleman that says, for this grid and with relation to this list, I want to get the currently selected object, please. So this acts as a middleman, and he acts as the route to the next component that we have. And in that component, we have a very simple expression, self.orders. So in the context of the currently selected object, which in this case is a customer, I want to get the orders. Okay? And the orders, if you remember rightly, and I'm sorry I didn't show the diagram particularly long earlier, is this association between the customer and the order class. It's a property, it's a list of objects at the other end. Okay? So, I want to get those objects, and I want to then bind this grid to them, which I have done by attaching them to that component. So all I have simply done is say pass on the list of orders for this one object. Okay? And again, very similar process to get to the orders, order items. So there's not actually a lot of code behind all of this. It's all managed through the forms and the designers and the components. Now, that's all great and good, like you say, but you know, sometimes we actually want to work with the objects in code. Well, that's true, indeed. And in this particular case, what I've done, as we saw earlier, was with the approve part, I actually called the method on the order object instance. The actual specific instance of that order object, I called a method called approve on, which we created earlier as part of our state machine that allowed me to say, I want to invoke a transition from whatever state you're in to approve. Okay? And the code above is just simply allowing me to speak to that transient in-between middleman and say, please get for me the specific instance of the selected object of this current order in the list of the grid that we were looking at earlier. Okay. So, that's all very nice and good, some people may say, but you know, all of that's done for me, and in this particular case, I am storing it somewhere. And in this particular case, I'm actually just storing it in a simple XML file. You'll see here, nothing exciting at all, but there's an XML file created for me, which maps all of those attributes that I've defined in my model and the classes all into data types for me in the XML. Fantastic. It will do that for wherever you are deciding to store your data. It's persistent at the end of the day. It's your data. You can choose what to store and what's transient that you're going to throw away at the end of the day. You don't have to store everything. And in the cases of many of those calculated types, you'll note that I probably do not have them. Order. Okay, so no. Okay, so in an instance of an order here, you'll notice I have links to the customer, I have some attributes, but you'll also notice there is absolutely no total value there. That's because that's a derived, a calculated type, it only occurs in memory, it's not saved and it's not persisted, so it's not stored in your database. Convenient in some cases, inconvenient if perhaps you wanted to run queries sometimes directly from the database who has orders about X, Y, Z. You can do derived attributes that actually can be persisted back as well. That's entirely up to you. So it's how you want to handle your objects at the end of the day. We are rushing along here. I'm sorry, I'm going to probably be as quick as I can because there's something else I want to show you as well. Now, in the case of when I was looking at the orders, I just bound them to a normal data grid here, but I also cheated a little bit and dropped on a grid from DevExpress. I don't know if any of you use DevExpress controls or have seen them before in the past, but they're a big control provider for .NET and many other frameworks out there. But I literally attached it to exactly the same list that my other grid is bound to, and this one allows me to also expand into the associations on my objects. So it completely understands how to interact with this object and how to drill down into other associations. You'll see how my order items has nicely been separated into order space items. It will do that for me if it notices mixed titles in my attributes and my list attributes and so on. That's all part of their component set. But the nice thing is, I can break down straight into this and I haven't written any extra code. I've just attached it to that grid and off I go. Okay. Now, in the diagram as well, I also have this object over here. It's nothing. It's a very basic class, but all I am doing with it is to represent that it actually inherits from the order item over here. And if I actually go and look into the code in the packages, so another item, and if I look at the code behind the scenes, it inherits from the order item in this case. So I can actually go and create an instance of that, but I can differentiate by the fact that it is actually a different type of object. So if I come into any of these orders and click create, what I've actually done is I've created it in code. In this particular case, I've created an instance of this object in code and assigned it to the currently selected order. Yet it was displayed straight away in my grid, you may have noticed. So it's actually created this new order line for me. So it's a two-way relationship. Just because I'm talking with the object in code does not mean it's not noticed by the framework. The framework has these objects all stored in memory, and the components and controls that represent how you data bind to them know how this is all working. So everything that's happening in memory is also completely allowable and interactable straight away. Okay, this is that observer pattern in practice. So as something knows it's got a new item in its list, it's updating everything that is attached to that saying, I want to look at your item. So in this case, it said, I've got a new item, add it to my list please. Anyone that's looking at it, here you go, new item. Oh, we got an awful lot to cover in a very short space of time. I had wanted to get on to one of the probably very underrated aspects of this framework that's very powerful but also very little known about is object versioning. And by that, it's quite a difficult one to explain. Yes, it will allow you to keep track of versions of an object over time, so changes to attributes, to lists, and so on. But it's more than that as well. It also allows you to potentially take a snapshot at a certain date and time and say, show me the database or the objects in the database at this point in time, and I want to see the exact state of those objects as they were at that point in time, which is very, very handy. It's being used in Sweden, in the legal system for judges to be able to preside over cases, but by the time the judge actually gets the case in front of him and it's gone through all the hoops to get to him, it's probably 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years down the road. The law's changed in that time, and the act as it stands now may not represent the act as it stood at the time that people filed their case and their grievance to the courts. So this system's actually being used to control that for them and allow them to revert back to the law as it stood at a specific state and time, to allow him to look at the actual version of that act at that state, so that he can preside over the case that's now landed on his desk 5 years later, which is quite handy, very, very handy. Also, many other people use it as a means for audit trail. You can identify what was changed when, who by, and so on, and it does it all for you, which is very, very handy. Now, I will try and run this really, really quickly, and I am sure we're going to run out of time very, very soon. But here is a database that I just created earlier, and this one's actually running in SQL Server, not attached to an XML file. But in this particular case, we have an item down here called that, and you can see we have some tables down here, and I will just do a quick view of those so that you can see that the data in there is exactly the data that we're looking at. So we've got Elizabeth and Kate as people. And if we go back to the application that's running, we have Elizabeth and Kate here. Okay. Now, Elizabeth has 3 children, Margie, Charles, and Andrew, and Kate has 1, and we call him Bob. Now, say perhaps something happens over time. It's 1900s after all, and children don't always survive in the young days. So we may wish to do something with it. I'm just going to cheat here and go into the debugging framework to allow me to actually do something very quickly. But I'm going to select a person, say Andrew, and we're just going to delete him. Okay. So we're not very happy. Andrew's died, but Bob is still with Kate, and Elizabeth still has Margie and Charles. So that's great. Okay, so we're going to update the database quickly. Now, nothing particularly exciting at all there. It's routine data. We've interacted with stuff. But hang on the right-hand side here, I've got Elizabeth selected, and I've got an Elizabeth. That's great. Okay. But down here in the bottom list, I have Margie, Charles, and Andrew. Okay, that's fine. We can see now that the data that we're looking at, which is current on the left-hand side, also has historic data that you can access. So you can also look at and interact with your objects. So I'm going to change Elizabeth's name, update the database, come back, and now we have 2 Elizabeths on the right-hand side. So I'm looking at the complete version history in each of these grids at a specific moment in time. Well, actually, I'm only doing so in this top right-hand grid. The object I'm selecting in that grid, I am looking at its exact children at that point in time that we want to refer to. Okay, so if we're going to go into Elizabeth, we'll just add another kid and we'll call her Lisa. Okay, update the database, off we go. Kate, and Elizabeth down there. Oh, yeah, what's that? That's right, I haven't changed Elizabeth recently, so it hasn't noticed that her list has changed again. So if I go back into here, blah, blah, Elizabeth, and there we go. Okay. So you can see that this is actually really quite powerful, and it has an awful lot of potential in so many applications where people need to keep hold of this data, but we end up rewriting the same basic things, audit layers, all this kind of stuff. And these guys have written a framework that's not only a really, really good object framework, but it also has some really, really practical uses elsewhere for some of the aspects like object versioning. So it allows an awful lot of power and an awful lot of flexibility for something that's actually really quite cheap as a component toolset. And I find myself using it time and time again for small applications. Now, in the case of the objects that we had there, when I load those objects into memory, it will initially load the IDs, perhaps from the database, and/or any attributes that I am looking at on a specific instance of an object at that point in time. I can also, however, decide that in the model, I don't want some of these attributes to be loaded. Oh, this is a really bad example, we've only got a few attributes. I don't want some of the attributes to be loaded straight away. I might want to delay load a notes field, or there might be a huge image or something that I don't want to actually load until I have the need to do so. And we can do that in the model, and it will control all of that interaction through the queries that it creates dynamically in the background. So potentially I don't want to store the date dispatched, which in this case is a bit pointless because it's a null value anyway for me, but we'll just say that, okay, we'll delay fetch that, and I'll update my code, and there you go, the database will do that for me from now on. So if I took it out of the data grids, because it's in the data grid, it will be loaded straight away, it's a bit of a bad example. If I tried to access it in code, you would then be able to see that a query would be running in the background and retrieve that object attribute for you, which is really, really quite handy. Now there are a whole bunch of supported databases, I do believe, out of the box. I've been using it for over 10 years probably now, so it's quite a mature framework and tool set. However, I did make the stupid mistake of installing a beta build before I did anything on this laptop recently, so there are a couple of issues when I tried to interact with the designer, not really there in the stable environment. But if I just quickly go to the design surfaces that represent the persistence mapper that I interact with, and pull up the toolset in Visual Studio, I'll be able to see a list of the ones that are supported out of the box. So we have MySQL, MySQL Server. There's definitely a Firebird one. I have no idea why it's not listed there. But there's also this interesting one called XML and Memory. Now the XML one you've seen earlier, I just used it to save to an XML file. But there's also a memory implementation of this, so you can interact with your objects in, say, a test environment, or even if you only want to store those objects temporarily in memory, and you want transient objects to still be thrown away, but you want fast access to your objects, but you're still deciding which ones you're saving and which ones you're not. Very, very handy in a unit test environment. You can structure your tests to work on and actually persist objects, and it will persist them. It'll just save them into a memory stream for you. You don't actually have to have database interacting code slowing down your tests, going direct to a database, or doing anything else. Fine. That's really, really very handy. Very helpful. And as I said earlier, you can have a DB, a multiple database mapper, and a few other things. But it does an awful lot of work for you for very little effort. And if you actually even download the component set off of their website, you can actually use it with models of up to 12 classes for free. So you can play around with it, see whether or not perhaps it suits your needs, whether or not you like it, whether or not you don't. But OCL is a little bit difficult, a little bit different from SQL. It takes a little bit of getting used to perhaps. So read some simple guides out there about some of the things you can do with OCL that you perhaps can't do with standard SQL quite so easily, or that requires additional SQL to do things. But that's all really part of how we all work with objects. For example, you might have a list of objects, and it may have lots of Daves, Kates and everything else, but you might want a set of only the instances of the unique objects. Well, that's just one call in OCL as set, and it will return you those unique objects for you to actually interact with. So you can limit your lists very quickly, and then start working with the actual objects you're interested in. Something that requires distinct and other refined SQL statements and so on. And at the end of the day, I used to write over 75% of my code was database interacting code. And now I don't have to. I can actually dedicate that time to solving business problems. You know, they have an actual need for this data and they want to do something with it. Now I've got a lot more time to make it work for them and show business return very quickly to them. So you can get a very, very quick prototype done, you can knock up models really, really quickly, and you can get, even if it's only in a desktop form perhaps, a very quick working system that can be demoed to upper management and so on, potentially to get budgetary approval and allow you to move on and do something different. Okay? I've probably forgotten an awful lot to talk about, but it's a very short period of time, and I'm sorry, I normally take about an hour and a half to talk about this stuff, so we've squeezed an awful lot in that time, and I must pass it on to the next person, because I think we're running out of time and space. I don't know whether or not we've got time for questions. Yeah? Questions, if anyone has any? I know I really flicked over it very, very quickly, so perhaps there's a lot of areas where it's quite difficult to ask, but you got any thoughts or any questions on how you interact with objects at the moment? How many of you use .NET? How many of you use UML? .NET? Yeah? UML occasionally, right? So I'm speaking to a mostly Java room, sorry folks. Zah?
Does it manage the schema for you? So can it create schemas?
Yes, it will do that for me. So if I am using, for example, let's go back to that version one because that's talking directly to an SQL Server database. So if I pull up the persistence mapper in this particular case, we have a connection to SQL Server. I can actually, if I just build the project quickly, you need to do a few little constraints. I can either evolve my schema if I've changed any attributes. In this particular case, I'll go through the model, through reflection, find out any changes that have occurred compared to the model in the current database revision, and it will tell you any suggestions that you have here. I can also just build the database completely. So if I want to, I can generate the database, and you see here, it will tell me that it's about to drop all of these tables, and then it will go off and recreate them for me. Okay? If I am evolving the application, let's go and just do a quick change to show this. So let's add an attribute to Elizabeth, and we'll just call it, well, attribute 1 will be fine. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And we'll just rebuild that quickly. No, hang on. Regenerate my code, of course. So if I now try to evolve the database, you'll see it says here, I have a new column to add, person attribute 1. And in the script section here, it's generated the DDL for me to allow me to go off, save that if I want to, and then go and run it against the database elsewhere if I need to, just to modify and bring that database up to speed. It does use UML in the database to store the mapping information about these objects. So there is a specific table in which it dumps a UML file in one row, and that's basically it. But it will save that UML file out for you as well, so you can just go and update the data in that row, and then off you go, deploy your new model assemblies to your environment and get using things, and your users will see the new version of your data system. Really hard to perhaps talk about some of the aspects that we could do, because I really didn't have a lot of time perhaps to show you some of the features and how I would perhaps interact and use it, the calculated aspects and so on. But there's an awful lot you can play with and have a fiddle, and I'm more than happy to take questions, and potentially if people would like to, you can always email me as well, and I'll happily answer some questions. There may well be some guides out there on the internet I can point people to, but it's a nice little tool set. I'm not saying it hasn't got its faults. It does have issues. It, as an object framework, wants to work with the object. So if you've got a lot of objects that perhaps are going to be deleted as part of an item, it's pulling the objects into memory to determine whether or not you want to delete these items. Why are you saying? Well, because you might have triggers and elements in your UML model to say that something happens in this particular condition. I want to check the constraints in that to allow me to delete the objects, perhaps. Not just go straight to a cascade delete in the database, delete one row, oh dear, accidentally deleted everything else that's related to it straight away. There may be business rules that you need to know about. But the nice thing about this is it does separate these things out into separate assemblies. So I can then go and use that model for a WinForm application. I can use it in the same ASP.NET web application that might be interacting with different aspects or different objects. I can use it anywhere that I can use that assembly, and it allows me to. So yeah, it's really quite helpful. Any other questions, folks? Sir?
How does it work? How does it compare performance-wise against something like the API framework?
I love this question because I've never really found an ORM that is perfect in the way it writes its SQL. This tries to minimize the database hits because it will go to the database and retrieve IDs. So it retrieves the amount of data it needs across the network in small chunks, rather than going to the database, pulling back rows, and then working with it. It will retrieve the objects you need when you need them to, or you can call routines to force it to load a set of objects in a range, and it will produce a more efficient query and load those objects. The problems come when you've got nested elements and so on. I have to admit, I think that you can do some things with Entity Framework that are better in terms of generation, but when you speak to people that use Entity Framework a lot, when they want to do complex things with it, they handwrite the code. They handwrite the SQL. And exactly the same can be said for this. I can write SQL to go off and do specific things, retrieve select objects if I want, or the IDs for select objects, or even their attributes if I want to, for, say, 10,000 out of a million row table, load those back in, and then I can run some code that has been put out there on the community to show you how to import all of that from your SQL statement and regenerate these objects for you. So the objects will think they've been loaded by the framework themselves, and all the other aspects will work, like the calculated route attributes and so on. I did want to actually show the derived lists, which will base off of values of objects, but I'm running out of time, and I know I'm going to cut into other people's time, so I'm going to try and cut it off here if I can. If anyone's got any questions in the break, feel free to come and accost me. It's not a problem at all. No other questions? Great. Thanks, folks.